Good morning, everyone. This is Jackson United Methodist Church Carr class Sunday School at home, and the Sunday School lesson date is May the 17th. And I'm so glad I get the opportunity to do this. Actually, right now, this is take two. I accidentally had taped, or thought I had taped, about half of this when I realized that I did not have the video on. Anyway, so I did have some practice. Well, I'm glad that y'all are here. And our lesson today is called God Provides Food in the Wilderness. And as I've told you before, it comes from the International Lesson Series, and our lesson book is called Adult Bible Studies. The author is Randy Cross, and the opinions and rewording and missteps comes from Lucia Fletcher. And I hope that this is a meaningful lesson. I enjoyed it. And it's really about understanding God's grace. And it takes place shortly after the children of Israel had made their way with Moses into the desert on their way to Canaan. We know this story. It's familiar. The Bible verses that I read from the NIV come from Exodus 16, 2 through 15. And I'm going to kind of jump around and not read them all, but it's a great story, and I think that it will be familiar to you. I want to start, though, with what the author says is the purpose of our lesson is to contrast our human nature with God's grace. And the key verse is, I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. So these are the verses. This comes from Exodus 16, and I'm going to read verses from 1 to 17 and kind of jump around a little bit, or jump over. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." Well, we know how the Israelites never follow instructions. That's my added opinion. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against them." "Who are we that you should grumble against us?" said Moses. "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." And I'm going to skip on. Aaron tells the children of Israel the same thing, what to do, what God expects of them. And then in the evening, the quail came and covered the camp. This is from verse 13. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." And I'm adding not more. of course, they don't start that way, but they eventually understand what they are to do. Something happened this week. I was I'd gone to the pharmacy, and I was standing near where the pharmacists are giving out their giving out prescriptions, and there was a lady standing there, and of course I had on my mask and stuff, and anyway, she said, not to me, but just to whoever heard her, she said, if God, I'm not going to wear a mask. If God wants me to have the virus, then I will get it. So, no mask for her. And I thought, well, all righty, you can be like that. I do know that God gave us a brain, and so I think he wants us to use that, but I kept my little opinion to myself about that. This lesson is about grace, God's grace. And last week we talked about that. We talked about God giving Adam and Eve leather coats when he sent them out into Eden, east of Eden in the land of Nod. God gives us grace. He doesn't have to, but he does. And that's what this lesson is about. Now, the Israelites, like I said, they were called children of Israelites for a reason. They were always fussing. Now, the author starts by talking about his own children fussing when they're on a trip or something, and made me think about some trips that we had been on. Now, there are 4 girls, and we each had our own approach to how we would try to manipulate our parents, I guess you could say, to get what we wanted. But one of us was a little bit more aggressive in talking to our dad than those of you that knew him. You know, he was the Colonel was what he was called, and he was the Colonel. Anyway, Lane was fuss. Oops, I'm going to tell her name. Anyway, there was a little fuss about something in the car. I have no recollection of what it was. Anyway, he stopped the car and told Lane she just had to get out. Well, our parents, our mother, was horrified. No, you can't do that. And he did. Lane got out because she was that stubborn that she would get out. But anyway, in a few minutes, it was all over, whatever it was, and she was back in the car. I really can't even remember all the details other than that part of it. And she recognized who Daddy was and his importance to our family. And he recognized grace. He gave it to us our whole lives. Now, the story of God, Moses, Aaron, and the Israelites is an interesting one. They were complaining. Moses says, why are you complaining against God? You know, you could complain against me, but they were complaining against God. They were whining. Whatever God did wasn't enough. As the lesson goes on, the author points out that, these are his words. I like this. He said, good grief. Keep in mind that this whining happened the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had left the land of Egypt. Remember, he had already parted the Red Sea for them so they could get away from the Egyptians. He said this is roughly a mere 45 days after they were set free from 400 years of slavery. And after only that short amount of time, they were in agony and distress, because things weren't going exactly their way. Well, have I ever been like that? I think I have. Your complaints, he says, aren't against us, but against the Lord. Now, the author goes on and talks about sin. He's describing what sin is, and I'm going to read his words again. Sin is not just being disobedient and doing things we know we should not do. Sin is an orientation in our lives that says we are most important and that we deserve all that we want and hope for. It says that life is all about me, and if I don't get everything I need and want, then someone is going to be blamed. Like I said, I thought that was kind of a harsh definition of sin, but isn't that what we do? It's all about me. me first, me only attitude. The author goes on and writes about that. And then he says something that kind of struck home with me too. And I really feel like I try to keep a positive attitude, and I know Larry does. And this is what the author, he said, we ought to read it as a caution not to get so carried away with me first, me only attitude. That way leads to death. The death of joy, the death of gratitude. It serves as a good reminder to us to take stock of what God has done in our lives. Ways God has provided for us, has delivered us, comforted us when we have been heartbroken, and undergirded our hopes and efforts. Important. Now, the next section he calls God's ear, and this is a section where Moses, of course, wrote this about God hearing what the Israelites were saying, and what are they going to do for us? What is he going to do for us? And he said, what does this tell us about God? Certainly, we have to use the word grace again. God has grace. He could simply put them out and say, see you later. God never did that. These are a few more words I liked. That is not to say that God is a heavenly wish granter or subject to our whining. It is to say that God's very nature is to care. God has cared for us in the past, cares for us today, and will care for us in the future. The grace of God means that we don't walk through this wilderness alone. When we experience desert times, that's what the author says, when we experience desert times, the claim of our faith allows us to thank God for the gift of grace that sees us through and helps us to survive. With meat in the evening and bread every morning, in whatever forms they take, God knows our needs and is at work in our lives to provide the grace we need to live this day. And I was thinking about grace. What is some grace that I have seen in our community? And I'll tell you, a couple that I've thought about is the school system stepping up the way they did. And I understand a lot why it happened, but the school system choosing and having the funds to be able to feed these school children all this time that they've been out of school. They went out of the way. There were parapros and teachers and the other school workers that went to the trouble of making sure these children had food and then took it to different places for them to pick it up. I mean, I think that is grace. Some other grace is that having Wi-Fi in the school buses, that this has been given to our community, and that the school buses can go and park in certain places for children that have no access to that. I look at that as grace. That is grace in our community. Now, the author goes on, and his next chapter is called Just Enough. When is it that we have just enough? And he starts off by talking about the fixer. Who is the fixer in your family? And in our family, I'm the breaker and Larry is the fixer. Matter of fact, this week I have broken 3 different glass things. And Larry's pointed that out to me. But now, you know, when glass breaks, you can't really fix it. But he fixes everything. He really works at it. He fixes the our grandchildren's toys. He's the fixer in our family and in other families as well. And then he looks at, besides having a fixer, when do we know that we've had just enough? He talks about the principle of just enough. Sometimes looks like we should try more, but the difference between failure and success lies in faith that is often just enough is enough. He gave the Israelites what they needed. not what they wanted, but what they needed. And of course, it's a human characteristic that we always think we need a little more. I'm getting carried away with telling stories, but I had thought about this one. I like shoes, and I buy too many pair. And decided I needed a new pair of tennis shoes because I was going to be walking a lot. That hadn't necessarily turned out to be, but that is why I thought I needed them. And I have so far bought 2 pair of tennis shoes that I think are the ones I need for my extra walking that I haven't quite done yet. And then last night I was sitting there thinking, well, I really need a white pair of tennis shoes. If I'm going to be out walking, I need them to be white tennis shoes. So sure enough, I start looking, and after a little while I stop and I just sort of shake my head at myself. But when is enough enough? How many pairs of walking tennis shoes do I need, since I haven't quite taken up the serious walking yet? When is enough enough? I am a spoiled person. And I hope I can do better, and I pray that I will do better. I want to read 2 more paragraphs that the author said. Every morning for 40 years, the Israelites woke up to bread for the day, daily bread. Every morning was an opportunity for them to thank God for what was provided to them. Although it appears as we move through Exodus that still the voice of the Israelites was more complaint than praise. And then he writes, perhaps the finest example of living in grace and knowing the grace of God is to continue to discern what is just enough in so many parts of our lives. I'm not talking about doing without what we genuinely need, but I believe we offer a greater witness of faith when we are not weighed down by the too much of life. Anything that we crave more than we need. Let each day's manna, be an exercise in faith, and know that God will provide for our needs so long as we trust and are obedient to God's instruction. He ends it with these 2 words: grace abounds. Now, I want to end with his prayer. He always writes a very lovely, short 2-sentence prayer. God of abundance, give me this day my daily bread, and give me faith to wait upon you for tomorrow's blessings. In Jesus' name, amen.